December 16th, 1980, Louisville, Kentucky. A hospital room on a quiet floor. Outside, the city was moving through its ordinary morning. Traffic on the bridges, Christmas lights blinking in shop windows, the Ohio River cold and indifferent beneath a gray sky. Inside room 412, the world had gone still. An old man lay in the bed, his breathing shallow, his famous white suit hanging untouched in the closet across the room, pressed, immaculate, waiting for a body that would never wear it again. His goatee had thinned to almost nothing. His hands, which had seasoned more chicken than any hands in American history, rested open at his sides, as though finally releasing something they had gripped for 90 years. Claudia sat beside him. She had been there through all of it. The backroad franchise trips, the slammed doors, the years when the car was their home, and the dream was the only currency they had. She held his hand now the way you hold something you know you are about to lose. She had been holding it in one way or another for more than 3 decades. Harland. David Sanders died that morning, quietly without spectacle, in a city that bore his adopted state's name. The news moved fast. By afternoon, flags across Kentucky had dropped to half-staff. Governor John Y. Brown Jr., the same man who had bought the colonel's company from him 16 years earlier for $2 million, ordered that Sanders lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort. It was an honor the Commonwealth reserved for governors, senators, and soldiers who had died in service to their country. Harland Sanders had never held public office. He had never carried a rifle into battle. What he had done was something harder to categorize, and, in its own way, more American than either. He had failed, repeatedly and spectacularly, across 5 decades and a dozen different lives. Farmhand, soldier, railroad man, tire salesman, lawyer, insurance agent. Before discovering, at an age when most men were already old, that he had always been a cook. He had built a global empire from a pressure cooker, a handshake, and 11 herbs and spices he never once wrote down for anyone who wasn't already standing in his kitchen. That was the public story, the one on the buckets, the one in the commercials, the one the world knew. But the true architecture of his legacy was not in the boardrooms or the franchise agreements or the corporate succession that came after. It was not even in the 27,000 restaurants that would eventually carry his face across 145 countries. It was in a house, a white-columned mansion on the outskirts of a small Kentucky town called Shelbyville, set back from US Route 60 on 3 quiet acres of rolling countryside. It was called Blackwood Hall, and this is its story. Every dynasty begins somewhere unglamorous, behind the gilded facades of the great American fortunes, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. There is always an earlier generation that no one photographs, a generation that worked in the cold, that went without, that carried the weight of survival on its back before the first dollar of real money was ever made. The founding wound, you might call it. The hunger that never quite leaves, even after the hunger is long gone. For Harland David Sanders, that wound opened early. He was born on September 9th, 1890, in a 4-room farmhouse outside Henryville, Indiana, a place so small and so forgotten by history that the only thing it would ever be remembered for was producing him. His father, Wilbur Sanders, worked 80 acres of Indiana soil, the kind of farming that asks everything of a man and returns just enough to keep him trying. There was a wife, Margaret. There were 3 children. There was always more month than money. Then, when Harland was 5 years old, Wilbur Sanders died. No great drama attended it. No scandal, no ruin, no fall from grace. Just illness, and then absence, and then the specific silence that fills a house when the person holding it together is gone. Margaret was left with 3 children, almost nothing in the bank, and the particular American predicament of having no one to ask for help. She found work at a tomato canning factory. She took in sewing from neighboring families. She disappeared for days at a time, and in her absence, the oldest child, a 5-year-old boy who had not yet started school, became, by necessity, the person in charge. Harland Sanders cooked his first full meal at the age of 7. Not because he was talented, not because anyone recognized something special in him and decided to cultivate it. He cooked because his brother and sister were hungry and there was no one else. He learned to stretch what the pantry offered, to build something from almost nothing, to make a meal feel like a meal even when the ingredients barely warranted the name. It was domestic engineering born of desperation, and it would become, decades later, the foundation of a global empire worth billions. But that was a long time away. When Harland was 10, he took his first paying job on a nearby farm. $4 a month, plus room and board. The kind of arrangement that passes for opportunity when opportunity is all you have. School had already become an afterthought, not a choice so much as a fact, the way poverty makes certain decisions before you're old enough to make them yourself. At 12, his mother remarried. The family relocated to Indianapolis, and a stepfather entered the picture. The relationship was, from the beginning, a bad one. The arguments escalated steadily, louder, harder, more violent with each passing month, until finally, at 13, Harland was sent away, packed off to a farm in Clark County, where he would live and work among strangers. His formal education ended in the 7th grade. He would never return to school. What followed was something that, in retrospect, looks less like a life and more like an extended audition. A man trying on identity after identity, none of them quite fitting, all of them leaving their mark. He worked as a farmhand, rising before dawn to feed livestock and collapsing into sleep long after dark. He became a streetcar conductor in Indianapolis, collecting fares and learning the cadence of a city. At 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the U.S. Army, shipping briefly to Cuba before receiving an honorable discharge and returning to America with nothing to show for it but the experience of having gone. The railroad came next. He worked as a fireman, not the kind who puts fires out, but the kind who feeds them, shoveling coal into the furnaces of steam engines grinding across the American heartland. It was brutal, physical work, the kind that ages a man in dog years. He left it for blacksmithing, then tire sales, then a stint as a ferryboat operator on a river whose name history has not bothered to preserve. He studied law through a correspondence course and briefly practiced in Arkansas, which ended when he got into a physical altercation with his own client in open court. That was the end of his legal career. He sold insurance. He failed at that too. In 1908, he married a woman named Josephine King. They had 3 children together. The marriage survived the relocations, barely, and the financial instability, barely, and the accumulating weight of a life that seemed constitutionally unable to find solid ground. And then, in the way that tragedy operates when it has already established a pattern, it took something irreplaceable. His son, Harland Jr., died at 20 years old. Blood poisoning, following a routine tonsillectomy. The kind of death that makes no sense. Too ordinary in its cause, too devastating in its consequence. A boy who should have recovered from a common procedure and come home. The grief, by all accounts, nearly finished him. By his mid-40s, Harland Sanders had accumulated the kind of biography that no one would choose. He had buried a child. He had failed at more occupations than most men attempt. He had moved so many times that permanence had become almost a foreign concept. His marriage was surviving in name more than in spirit. His finances were, as they had been for most of his life, precarious at best. He was not, by any conventional measure, a man on the verge of building something. And yet, the chapter that would define everything, the kitchen, the recipe, the white suit, the empire, had not even begun. There is a particular kind of American story that begins not in a boardroom or a ballroom, but at the side of a road. Not the romantic road of mythology, not Route 66 at golden hour, not the open highway of freedom and possibility. The other kind, the working road, the road that smells of motor oil and exhaust, where the men who stop are tired and the conversations are short and the currency is not prestige but need. That was US Route 25 in 1930, and that was where Harland Sanders, 40 years old and carrying the wreckage of a dozen failed lives, finally found the thing he had been circling his entire existence. America in 1930 was a country coming apart at the seams. The Depression had arrived with the particular cruelty of a system that punishes the vulnerable first and most severely. Factories shuttered, banks collapsed, taking with them the savings of families who had spent decades building what vanished in an afternoon. Across the country, men who had believed in the promise of honest work found themselves standing in lines, hats in hand, waiting for something, anything, that resembled a future. Into this landscape, Harland Sanders drove to Corbin, Kentucky, and took over a Shell service station along the main north-south artery, cutting through the Appalachian region. It was not, on its surface, a distinguished beginning. There was no capital behind it, no family name to trade on, no inheritance to cushion the risk. There was a building, a road, and the constant procession of travelers passing through, their tanks empty, their stomachs emptier. Most men running a Depression-era gas station would have sold gasoline and been grateful for the business. Sanders saw something else entirely. In the back room of that service station, he set up a table. 6 seats. Nothing more than a domestic arrangement pressed into commercial service. The same instinct that had driven a 7-year-old boy in Indiana to feed his siblings from a near-empty pantry now applied to strangers passing through a Kentucky crossroads. He cooked what he knew: steaks, country ham, and fried chicken, prepared according to recipes he had been refining for 30 years, in kitchens no one had ever paid attention to, for people who had never thought to ask where the food came from or how it was made. Word traveled the way it always travels along working roads, slowly at first, then all at once. Locals who had stopped for fuel began stopping for the food. Travelers who learned about the backroom table started rerouting their journeys to include it. By 1937, the demand had outgrown the arrangement entirely. Sanders built a proper restaurant across the street, the Sanders Cafe, seating 142 guests, and added a motel beside it, offering weary travelers a bed to accompany their meal. The operation was modest by the standards of the great American hospitality establishments, nothing approaching the Greenbrier or the Homestead, the grand resort hotels that catered to a different class of traveler entirely. But along Route 25, the Sanders Cafe had become something those establishments never quite managed to be: indispensable. Then came the recognition. In 1935, Kentucky Governor Ruby Laffoon granted Harland Sanders the honorary title of Kentucky Colonel, a ceremonial distinction bestowed upon citizens deemed to have contributed something meaningful to the Commonwealth. It was the kind of honor that most recipients accepted graciously and promptly forgot. Sanders did something different with it. He understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life watching opportunity arrive in unconventional forms, that the title was not an award. It was a brand. He became Colonel Sanders. He grew the goatee. He traded his workman's clothes for a white suit and added a black string tie. An image assembled with the deliberateness of a man who understood that in America appearance and identity are not separate things. The persona he constructed was specific: Southern, distinguished, authoritative, warm. A figure who carried the weight of tradition without the coldness of old money. A colonel without a war, which made him, in a strange way, more accessible than any general. By 1939, Duncan Hines, the most influential food critic in America, whose name would eventually become synonymous with the industrialization of home baking, had visited the Sanders Cafe and included it in his guidebook, Adventures in Good Eating. The review confirmed what Route 25 travelers already knew, that something genuinely worth stopping for was happening in Corbin, Kentucky. For a man who had spent 40 years failing at everything he attempted, it must have felt, finally, like a rival. It didn't last. In the early 1950s, the federal government announced plans for the interstate highway system, the most ambitious infrastructure project in American history. A network of high-speed roads that would, its architects promised, bind the nation together and carry commerce from coast to coast. For most Americans, it was progress. For Harland Sanders, it was a death sentence delivered in the language of public policy. The planned route for Interstate 75 would bypass Corbin entirely. He watched the construction crews from a distance, the way you watch something inevitable that you are powerless to stop. Every mile of fresh asphalt laid down in the mid-1950s was a mile further from his front door. The travelers who had sustained him, who had turned a backroom table into a landmark into a local institution, would now pass through a version of Kentucky that didn't include him at all. They would never know what they were missing, because they would never know it existed. By 1956, the Sanders Cafe was finished, traffic thinned to almost nothing. The motel room sat empty and accumulating dust. The kitchen that had once run from dawn to midnight went quiet. At 65 years old, an age at which the great dynasties of American industry were celebrating their legacies, commissioning portraits, endowing university buildings, Harland Sanders was forced to sell his life's work at auction. When the hammer fell, it barely covered his debts. What remained, after the mortgage and the outstanding bills, was a monthly Social Security check for $105, a pressure cooker, a handwritten recipe, a white suit, slightly worn, and a Kentucky Colonel certificate that the state had given him 20 years earlier, back when the future had seemed like something other than this. He packed everything into his car. Then he drove away from Corbin and began again. Consider the image for a moment. For an old man in a white suit driving alone through the back roads of America in the late 1950s. No appointment waiting at the other end, no assistant riding beside him, no corporate infrastructure behind him, no family name to open doors or soften the reception. Just a pressure cooker in the trunk, a recipe committed entirely to memory, and the particular stubbornness of a man who has been refused so many times that refusal has lost its power to wound him. This was Harland Sanders at 65, not declining, not settling, beginning. The great American dynasties, the ones whose names appear on museum wings and university buildings and the brass plates of Manhattan law firms, were built, almost without exception, on timing and leverage. Cornelius Vanderbilt understood railroads before anyone else understood what railroads would become. John D. Rockefeller saw that controlling the refineries mattered more than controlling the oil. The Carnegies, the Mellons, the Fords, each of them had caught a wave at precisely the moment it was forming and had ridden it to a height that made the effort look, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Harland Sanders had no wave. He had a recipe and a car and the discipline of a man who had learned, through 5 decades of hard and humbling experience, that the only variable he could reliably control was whether or not he stopped. His proposition was almost defiantly simple. He would drive to restaurants across the country, unannounced, and offer to cook. If the owner liked what he tasted, Sanders would license him the recipe and the right to use his name. In exchange, he wanted 5 cents for every piece of chicken sold. No lawyers drafted the agreement, no contracts were notarized. A handshake closed the deal, and a man's word was the only instrument of enforcement either party possessed. It was, by every conventional measure of mid-century American commerce, an absurd business model. The first months were what you would expect them to be. Restaurant owners looked at this white-suited man standing in their doorways, older than their fathers, driving a car that had seen better decades, speaking with the evangelical certainty of someone selling something no one had asked to buy. and they said no. Some said it politely, others did not bother with politeness. Doors closed, phones went unanswered. The laughter, when it came, was not particularly quiet. Sanders slept in the back of his car. He washed in gas station bathrooms. He ate whatever was cheap enough to leave his modest Social Security check mostly intact for fuel. Claudia traveled with him when she could, sharing the cramped quarters and the accumulating weight of rejection with the same quiet steadiness she had brought to everything else in their life together. They had slept in worse places. They had faced longer odds. He did not stop. There is something in this period of Sanders's life that resists easy romanticization, which is perhaps why it endures as a story worth telling. It was not glamorous. It was not the stuff of founding mythology. No grand vision delivered from a mountaintop. No single transformative moment when everything changed. It was simply a man, driving, cooking, being rejected, and driving again. Day after day, month after month, across the length and width of an indifferent country. And then, slowly, it began to work. The first Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise opened in 1952 in Salt Lake City, Utah. The operator was a restaurateur named Pete Harmon, who had tasted Sanders's chicken and understood immediately that he was holding something with genuine commercial power. Harmon coined the phrase that would eventually appear on every bucket, every sign, every piece of advertising the brand would ever produce: finger-licking good. He introduced the paper bucket, that particular cylindrical red and white container that would become one of the most recognizable pieces of packaging in the world. The restaurant succeeded. Word moved through the informal networks of the American restaurant industry the way useful information always moves. Laterally, person to person, without ceremony. Restaurant owners who had dismissed Sanders began calling him. The dynamic inverted. He was no longer the man arriving uninvited at back doors. He was the man whose phone was ringing. By 1959, he had over 200 franchises operating across the United States and into Canada. By 1963, that number had passed 600. Kentucky Fried Chicken was no longer a regional curiosity or a roadside novelty. It was a phenomenon, a brand expanding at a velocity that the great consumer companies of the era, the ones with proper headquarters and legal departments and boards of directors, were watching with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. The Colonel's face appeared on every bucket, every storefront, every advertisement. The white suit, the black string tie, the goatee. The image was everywhere, and everywhere it carried the same quality. Authority without arrogance, tradition without exclusivity. The suggestion that what was inside the bucket had been made by someone who actually knew what they were doing and cared whether it was right. He was no longer simply a man selling chicken. He was a brand. Which is to say, he had become something larger than himself, something that would, in time, outlast him entirely. Empires require seats of power. The great dynasties understood this intuitively. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore not merely to live in, but to announce, with 4 acres of limestone and 65 fireplaces, that their presence in the American landscape was permanent and intentional. The Rothschilds raised Waddesdon Manor on an English hillside to communicate, in the architectural language of French chateaux, that a family of Jewish bankers had arrived among the landed gentry and intended to stay. Even the robber barons who dismissed ostentation as vulgar still maintained the estates, the clubs, the addresses that located them precisely in the hierarchy of things. Harland Sanders needed something analogous, if considerably less grand. He needed a place from which to run an operation that had outgrown the backseat of a car. He needed somewhere to receive the franchisees who were now coming to him, to train them properly, to establish the standards that would hold the brand together across hundreds of individual operations scattered across 2 countries. He needed, in short, a home that could also function as a command post. He found it in Shelbyville, Kentucky. On a property along US Route 60, set back from the road on 3 quiet acres of Shelby County countryside, stood a house that had been watching Kentucky history pass by since 1866. Blackwood Hall was built the year after the Civil War ended, in that strange, uncertain season when the South was still sorting out what it had become and what it was permitted to be. The house was substantial without being excessive. 5,000 square feet spread across 2 stories, with the high ceilings and hardwood floors and generous windows that characterized the better domestic architecture of the period. A wide porch wrapped across the front, offering the kind of view that invites a person to stand still for a moment and simply look at the land. The name, reportedly drawn from a Nancy Drew novel, carried a faint literary air that sat pleasantly against the property's more practical virtues. For nearly a century, Blackwood Hall passed through the hands of various owners, accumulating the small histories that older houses absorb without effort: renovations, celebrations, ordinary domestic years that leave no record beyond the wear on the floors and the particular way the light falls through windows that haven't moved in 100 years. When Harland and Claudia Sanders first saw it in 1959, something resolved. For Claudia, the resolution was personal. She had lived out of suitcases and car seats for years, had mixed spice blends on whatever surface was available, and answered franchise inquiries from wherever a telephone could be found. Blackwood Hall was a home, a real one, with rooms and permanence, and the particular dignity of a house that has already proven it intends to last. For Harland, the resolution was operational. Behind the main house, there was room to build the warehouse and office the growing enterprise required. The location sat along a major highway with clean access to Louisville and the broader Kentucky infrastructure. The house itself could absorb the constant traffic of franchisees traveling to learn from the source. They purchased it without hesitation and moved in immediately. What happened inside Blackwood Hall in the years that followed was, in the context of American business history, genuinely unusual. Almost every week, men arrived from across the country to be trained by the colonel himself. They came to learn the recipe, not to receive it written on a card, but to stand in a kitchen and watch it made, to understand through proximity and repetition what no document could adequately convey. Sanders worked at the original stove in his immaculate white suit, string tie precisely knotted, and demonstrated with the exacting patience of a craftsman who had been perfecting this particular thing for 30 years. His standards were absolute. His tolerance for approximation was non-existent. When something was wrong, he said so, at volume and in language that surprised people who had expected, from the grandfatherly image on the bucket, something more pastoral. But the men who came through that kitchen left carrying something that could not be replicated by a training manual or a corporate orientation program. They had stood at the original stove. They had watched the original hands. They had received the knowledge in the direct, unmediated way that craft has always been transmitted, not through instruction, but through presence. For those franchisees, a visit to Blackwood Hall was not a business trip, it was a pilgrimage. And the stove they cooked on still stands in that kitchen today, silent, cast iron, indifferent to time, a witness to the moment a man in a white suit turned everything he had survived into something the world could not ignore. There is a particular cruelty reserved for founders. Not the cruelty of failure. Most founders have made their peace with that long before they build anything worth keeping. The cruelty reserved for founders is different, quieter, and in many ways more difficult to survive. It is the cruelty of success. The moment when the thing you built outgrows you. When the empire you assembled from nothing becomes, in the hands of people with better educations and colder calculations, something you no longer entirely recognize. Harland Sanders encountered that cruelty in 1964 at the age of 73 in the form of a very reasonable offer. By that point, Kentucky Fried Chicken had become something that defied the conventional vocabulary of American business success. More than 600 franchises operating across the United States and Canada. Millions of dollars in annual revenue flowing through an operation that had begun, barely a decade earlier, as one old man driving alone through the back roads of a country that wasn't paying attention. The Colonel's face was everywhere. The brand had achieved the rare and slightly uncanny status of institutions that stop feeling like businesses and start feeling like permanent features of the landscape, like the interstate highways themselves, or the chain hotels that had colonized every exit ramp from Maine to California. It was, by any honest accounting, a triumph. It was also eating him alive. At 73, Sanders was traveling over 200,000 miles a year. He was attending meetings, resolving disputes, visiting restaurants, maintaining the evangelical quality consciousness that had always been the engine of his standards. The insistence that every piece of chicken, coming out of every KFC kitchen in 2 countries, should taste exactly as it had tasted in the back room of a Shell station in Corbin, Kentucky, in 1930. That insistence was not compatible with scale. Scale demands compromise. It demands the smoothing of edges, the rounding of particulars, the substitution of systems for the irreplaceable authority of one man's palate and one man's presence. Sanders knew this. He also knew that he could not be in 600 places at once, and that the gap between what the brand promised and what it was increasingly delivering was widening in ways he could feel but no longer control. Then came John Y. Brown Jr. and Jack C. Massey. Brown was 30 years old, a lawyer's son from Lexington, with the particular combination of charm and cold-eyed opportunism that produces either great politicians or great deal-makers, and occasionally both. Massey was a Nashville businessman who understood, with the instincts of a man who had made his money in hospital supply chains, that the most valuable thing a brand can possess is not its product but its system, the replicable, scalable mechanism that produces the product identically, everywhere, every time. Together, they approached Sanders with a proposition that was, in its structure, the oldest transaction in the history of American capitalism. The founder sells, the operators scale, and everyone pretends afterward that the arrangement was inevitable. The price was $2 million, approximately $19 million in current value. Sanders would relinquish operational control of the company, but retain his role as its public face, its spokesperson, its living symbol. He would continue traveling, continue appearing in advertisements, continue being the Colonel, but the decisions, the standards, the direction of the enterprise would pass to men who had not spent 30 years perfecting a recipe in a series of kitchens no one had thought to remember. It was, on paper, generous. It was, in practice, the transaction that would define the final chapter of his life, and not entirely in the ways he had anticipated. He signed. The great estates of the American Gilded Age were built by men who had sold something and then spent the rest of their lives trying to prove that the money, at least, had been worth it. The Vanderbilts who raised Biltmore in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the Posts who assembled Mar-a-Lago from imported Spanish tiles and gold leaf ceilings, the Rockefellers who remade entire landscapes to accommodate their sense of what permanence should look like. All of them were, in one way or another, managing the psychological aftermath of transactions that had made them rich and left them restless. Sanders was not that kind of man, and Blackwood Hall was not that kind of house. He had not sold his company to build a monument. He had sold it because his body was tired, and the arithmetic of mortality had finally made itself plain. $2 million was security, the one thing he had never possessed in 73 years of trying. It was the thing his mother had never had, that his first marriage had buckled under the absence of, that had driven him across the back roads of America with a pressure cooker and a prayer. He had bought himself, at last, the right to stop worrying. What he had not fully anticipated was what it would cost him to watch. The new owners moved quickly, as new owners always do. They brought in management consultants and efficiency experts. the professional class whose function is to identify everything about an operation that cannot be measured and eliminate it in favor of everything that can. The gravy recipe was simplified. Preparation methods were standardized in ways that saved time and reduced labor costs and produced, in Sanders's estimation, food that bore his name but not his standards. He did not suffer this quietly. Harland Sanders had never been a man who kept his opinions at a comfortable volume. His temper was an instrument he had used his entire life, sometimes constructively, sometimes not, but always authentically. In interviews, and there were many, because the press understood that a founding patriarch at war with his own corporate successors was exactly the kind of story that sells, he described the company's gravy as something closer to wallpaper paste than food. He made unannounced visits to KFC restaurants across the country, and when the chicken disappointed him, he said so. Loudly. Occasionally, he pushed the offending plate onto the floor to make the point with appropriate finality. The corporate executives who now ran his company found this considerably less charming than the public did. In 1973, Sanders sued Häublein Incorporated, the conglomerate that had by then acquired KFC as part of its expanding portfolio of consumer brands, alleging misuse of his image and likeness for products he had never approved. 2 years later, Häublein returned the gesture, suing him for defamation after his public attacks on their gravy crossed a legal threshold that their lawyers felt warranted a response. The suit was unsuccessful, but the message it delivered was unambiguous. The Colonel and his company had become adversaries, bound together by contract and by the commercial necessity of his face on their packaging, but operating in a state of sustained, barely managed hostility that would characterize their relationship for the rest of his life. Back at Blackwood Hall, Sanders and Claudia reached a decision that was equal parts defiance and practicality. In 1968, they converted the warehouse building behind the main house, the same structure where Claudia had spent years mixing and packaging the secret spice blend, filling orders by hand, shipping supplies to franchises across the continent, into a full-service restaurant. They called it the Colonel's Lady. It served authentic Kentucky cuisine, including fried chicken prepared according to the standards Sanders had spent his life establishing, without the corporate modifications he found intolerable. It was, in its quiet way, a declaration that the original still existed, that quality had not been retired along with his controlling interest, that there was a version of his food that remained exactly what it had always been meant to be. KFC's lawyers identified this immediately for what it was. The threats came first, then the lawsuit, then the settlement, the mechanism by which American business disputes are resolved when both parties have enough at stake to prefer an agreement over a verdict. Sanders received $1 million. The restaurant was renamed the Claudia Sanders Dinner House, removing the Colonel's title from the signage and satisfying the legal requirement that it not be positioned as a direct competitor to the brand he had sold. Sanders agreed, in turn, to cease his public criticism of Kentucky Fried Chicken's food quality. There was, reportedly, one final condition he insisted upon before signing, that the corporate executives responsible for the changes he found most objectionable sit with him in the kitchen at Blackwood Hall while he demonstrated, one more time, how the chicken was supposed to be made. Whether they absorbed the lesson is not recorded. What is recorded is that the Claudia Sanders Dinner House thrived from the day it opened, drawing locals and travelers in numbers that validated everything Sanders had believed about the appetite for food made without shortcuts, in a place that carried the weight of genuine history. And through it all, the mansion stood watch. Quiet, white-columned, set back from the road on its 3 acres of Shelby County countryside, Blackwood Hall absorbed the scandals and the lawsuits and the corporate maneuvering with the indifference that old houses reserve for the troubles of the people who live inside them. The story of Claudia Sanders is, in many ways, the story that the white suit has always obscured. She enters the historical record as a waitress at the Sanders Cafe in Corbin in the 1930s. Young, capable, warm in the particular way that makes a person indispensable to someone whose own warmth is unreliable. Sanders was still married to Josephine then, his first wife, the mother of his 3 children, and the companion of nearly 3 decades of poverty and relocation, and the accumulating disappointments that had characterized his middle life. Josephine had endured a great deal. The constant moves, the failed ventures, the grief of losing a son to blood poisoning from a routine procedure. These were not small things, and they had left marks. By the time Sanders encountered Claudia, his first marriage had been hollowed out by everything it had been asked to carry. What remained was form without substance, a domestic arrangement that had ceased to function as anything more than habit. The affair was not a fairy tale, it was a human transaction, complicated and costly in the way that such things always are, most directly for Josephine, who had invested 39 years in a man who ultimately chose someone else. In 1947, the marriage ended in divorce. 2 years later, in 1949, Harland and Claudia were married in Corbin. History is rarely tidy about these arrangements, but history is also compelled, by the weight of evidence, to acknowledge what Claudia Sanders became once the formalities were settled. She became, without exaggeration, the operational soul of everything that followed. During the franchise years, those grinding, unglamorous years of sleeping in cars and absorbing rejection on back roads across America, Claudia was there. She shared the cramped quarters and the thin meals and the particular exhaustion of believing in something that the world had not yet agreed to believe in. At Blackwood Hall, she mixed the spice blends by hand and packaged them and shipped them and answered the phones and kept the machinery running while her husband traveled and trained and argued and built. She was not a supporting character in this story. She was its co-author, working from a room that no one photographed. When Sanders named the restaurant after her, it was not a sentimental gesture. It was an acknowledgement, however belated, however imperfect, that the thing he had built had been built by 2 people, and that one of them had never received adequate credit while it was happening. The Claudia Sanders dinner house was his correction of the record, his monument to her. The one thing the corporation could not rename or acquire or simplify into something more efficient. By the 1970s, Harland Sanders had achieved a peculiar and rarefied status in American life. His face appeared on more surfaces, in more countries, than that of most living statesmen. The white suit, the black string tie, the goatee. The image was so thoroughly reproduced and so universally recognized that it had begun to function less as a representation of a person and more as a kind of secular icon, a symbol whose original referent had been almost entirely absorbed by its own reproduction. Children in Tokyo and London and Johannesburg knew the Colonel's face without knowing anything about Corbin, Kentucky, or the Shell station on Route 25, or the interstate that had destroyed everything and forced a 65-year-old man to start again with a pressure cooker and a hope. At Blackwood Hall, he was still simply Harland. He rose early, as he always had, the habit of farm work and railroad labor, and 5 decades of mornings that required him to be useful before dawn. He dressed carefully in the white suit. He adjusted the tie. He went downstairs to the kitchen, where Claudia had breakfast waiting, and they sat together in the particular silence of 2 people who have shared so much that conversation has become optional. The house itself carried the evidence of the journey in every room, certificates and photographs, a Kentucky Colonel certificate on the wall, the document that had given him his name and, in a sense, his life, his Bible on the nightstand, worn in the way that suggests consultation rather than display. Personal memorabilia accumulated over 60 years of a life that had moved through too many places to count and arrived, finally, here. The mansion was not grand by the standards of the great American estates. It was not Biltmore, with its 65 fireplaces and its 4 acres under one roof. It was not Mar-a-Lago, with its gold-leaf ceilings and its imported tiles, and its architect's mandate to build something that could not be dismissed. Blackwood Hall was 5,000 square feet of good Kentucky construction, comfortable and well-maintained, and possessed of the quiet authority that comes not from ostentation, but from duration, from the simple fact of having stood and weathered and endured. It suited him exactly. The white suit grew slightly rumpled in the late 1970s. The goatee thinned. The body that had been driven across 200,000 miles of American road every year for 2 decades began, with the inevitability that no amount of stubbornness can finally prevent, to register the accumulated cost of the distances it had traveled. In June of 1980, the diagnosis arrived: acute leukemia. He was 89 years old. The cancer had come, as such things tend to, not as a surprise exactly, but as a confirmation, the formal notification that a process already underway had a name and a timeline. Sanders received the news with the equanimity of a man who had been preparing for bad news his entire life, and had long ago decided that his response to it would be the same, regardless of its specific content. He kept going. Through the summer and into the fall of 1980, he continued traveling, continued appearing, continued shaking hands and posing for photographs and representing, with the full weight of his physical presence, the brand that had been built from his name and his image, and the recipe he had never written down for anyone who wasn't already standing in his kitchen. Between hospital stays, he showed up at restaurants. He wore the suit. He made the appearances. If he was going to die, and he understood clearly now that he would die as the Colonel, in motion, doing the thing he had done every day for 25 years, not as a patient, not in retreat. In early November, he was admitted to Jewish Hospital in Louisville. Pneumonia had complicated the leukemia, the way secondary crises tend to arrive once the primary defense has been sufficiently weakened. Claudia came and stayed. The children and grandchildren gathered in the way that families gather when the gathering itself is a form of acknowledgement. On December 16, 1980, Colonel Harland David Sanders died. He was 90 years old. The news traveled through Kentucky the way news travels in a place where a person has become part of the landscape, not as information exactly, but as the announcement of an absence that would take time to fully register. Flags dropped to half-staff across the Commonwealth before the afternoon was out. Governor John Y. Brown, Jr., the same man who had purchased Kentucky Fried Chicken from Sanders 16 years earlier for $2 million, the transaction that had set in motion everything that followed, ordered that the Colonel's body lie in state at the Kentucky State Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort. The honor was one the Commonwealth reserved for governors, senators, and soldiers who had died in their country's service. Sanders had been none of those things. He had been something the honor's conventional architecture was not quite designed to accommodate. A cook, a franchisor, a man who had failed at everything until he hadn't, who had built a global institution from a recipe and a handshake, and the refusal to accept that 65 was too late to begin. Kentucky gave him a statesman's farewell anyway because it understood, even if the official protocols didn't quite have the vocabulary for it, that what he had built was a form of public service, that the face on the bucket was a face that had put the state on a map that the state's politicians and soldiers had never quite managed to mark with the same indelibility. On December 17th, mourners gathered at the Hall Taylor Funeral Home in Shelbyville, the town where Blackwood Hall stood, the town where the empire had been administered from a kitchen with an original stove and a dining room that franchisees had traveled across the country to sit in. The Colonel lay in an open casket in his white suit, his black string tie knotted with the precision that had defined every public appearance of the last 4 decades. His walking cane was tucked beneath his right arm. Red roses and white chrysanthemums lined the walls. Claudia led the procession of family, daughters, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the generations that the empire had made possible. Most of the people who filed past the casket were neighbors. Not dignitaries, not corporate representatives, not the executives who had simplified the gravy and sent the lawyers. Neighbors. People who had watched the man build something from the mansion down the road and had understood, because they were close enough to see the daily reality of it, that what he had built was not accidental. On December 19th, the body was moved to KFC headquarters in Louisville, where it lay in state for a second day. More than 1,000 people came through. Most had never met him personally. They had grown up with his face as a fixed feature of the visual landscape of American life. One of those images so thoroughly integrated into daily experience that its removal creates a shape, an outline where something used to be. The funeral service, held on December 20th at the Alumni Memorial Chapel of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, drew over 1,200 people inside and more outside in the December cold. Governor Brown was there. Business leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens who had driven to Louisville from across Kentucky because they felt, obscurely but genuinely, that something that belonged to them had ended and deserved to be marked. At Sanders's personal request, Pat Boone sang "He Touched Me," a gospel hymn that spoke to the faith that had sustained him through the decades of hardship, the faith he had kept quietly but consistently, the Bible on the nightstand at Blackwood Hall worn with the use of someone who meant it. "Dying doesn't bother me," he had said once, standing at the gravesite he had selected in advance, with the practical, unsentimental directness that had characterized everything about him. "I've had a good life. No sucker in the world has had more ups and downs and more pleasure." The procession wound through Louisville to Cave Hill Cemetery, where explorer George Rogers Clark and thousands of Civil War soldiers already rested beneath Kentucky soil. Sanders was laid beside them, beneath a monument with 4 columns and a bronze bust made by his daughter Margaret. He was buried in the white suit, exactly as he had lived. The great houses of America have a habit of outlasting the people who built them. Biltmore still stands in its Blue Ridge Valley, drawing 1 million visitors a year through rooms that George Vanderbilt never imagined would be open to the public. Mar-a-Lago still occupies its 17 acres of Palm Beach Barrier Island, having survived the woman who built it, the government that neglected it, and every controversy that followed. Waddesdon Manor still crowns its English hilltop, the Rothschild chandeliers still catching the afternoon light through windows that watched 2 world wars pass at a careful distance. These houses endure not because stone and timber are permanent, nothing is permanent, but because the stories they contain are too consequential to be quietly absorbed by time. They hold their ground through sheer narrative weight, through the accumulated force of everything that happened inside them, and the human need to stand in the places where history was made and feel, however briefly, that the distance between then and now is not as absolute as it appears. Blackwood Hall is a more modest proposition than any of those. 5,000 square feet on 3 Kentucky acres, set back from a state highway in a town that most Americans could not locate on a map without assistance. By the standards of the great American estates, it barely registers. And yet, when Claudia Sanders returned to it alone in December of 1980, she was returning to a house that had already absorbed more history than most buildings twice its size and 3 times its age. A house that would spend the next 4 decades quietly insisting that the story it contained was not finished. She was right. It wasn't. The weeks after a great man's death have a particular texture that the weeks before it never quite prepare you for. The funeral ends. The governor goes back to the Capitol. The 1,000 employees who filed through the lobby at KFC headquarters return to their routines. The flowers from the casket begin, in the way of flowers, to acknowledge their own impermanence. And the person who was closest, who held the hand at the end, who sat beside the bed through the final nights, goes home to a house that still contains everything the way he left it, and finds that the silence has a specific quality she has never heard before. Claudia Sanders was 78 years old when she walked back through the door at Blackwood Hall. She had spent 31 years in this house as its presiding presence, the woman who mixed the spice blends and answered the franchise calls and kept the machinery running while her husband traveled and argued and trained and built. She had been the operational intelligence behind an empire that history had mostly credited to a man in a white suit, because history has always found it easier to locate genius in a single face than to account for the labor of the person standing just outside the frame. The house was full of him, his Bible on the nightstand, his Kentucky Colonel certificate on the wall, the original stove in the kitchen, cold now, still holding in its cast iron, the residual authority of 10,000 cooking lessons delivered to men who had traveled across the country to learn from the source. His photographs on the walls, his memorabilia in the rooms, his presence in every corner of a space that had been organized around him for 3 decades. She did not retreat into grief. That was not her character, and it was not the kind of tribute he would have recognized as appropriate. She went back to work. The Claudia Sanders dinner house opened each morning and served each evening exactly as it had before. The fried chicken came out of the kitchen with the same exacting standards the Colonel had established in this building when it was still a warehouse and he was still alive to enforce them personally. The country ham, the creamed spinach, the yeast rolls, those legendary yeast rolls that had become, over the years, as much a part of the restaurant's identity as the name above the door, arrived at tables with the same warmth they had always carried. The pies. Claudia moved through the dining room the way she had always moved through it, with the quiet authority of a woman who understood that hospitality is not a performance but a standard, and that standards do not observe mourning periods. For 4 years after Harland's death, she maintained Blackwood Hall and the restaurant beside it with the same dedication she had brought to the enterprise for 30 years. Visitors who came for the food and stayed to ask about the house received her attention with the same grace she had always extended to the franchisees and journalists and curious strangers who had passed through during the empire's peak years. She was not performing resilience. She was simply constitutionally incapable of its opposite. But by 1984, the weight of it had accumulated past what she chose to carry alone. The great estates of the American dynasties have almost always required, at some point, a moment of deliberate transfer, a decision by the generation that built them to place them in other hands before time or circumstance made the choice on their behalf. The Vanderbilts opened Biltmore to the public in 1930 because the alternative was watching it decline. The Rothschilds bequeathed Waddesdon to the National Trust because they understood that a house of that significance belonged, in some essential way, to more than a single family. Even Mar-a-Lago, that monument to the ambition and the wound of Marjorie Merriweather Post, was donated to the federal government because its owner, at the end, grasped that she had built something too large and too laden with history to simply dissolve into an estate sale. The instinct behind all of these decisions is the same. The recognition that certain things, once built, carry an obligation that outlasts the people who built them. That stewardship is a form of responsibility. That the right transfer, to the right hands, at the right moment, is itself an act of creation. Claudia Sanders understood this. Thomas and Cherry Settle had been inside the orbit of the Sanders family for years. Employees and friends, people who had absorbed the culture of the enterprise from the inside out, who understood not just the mechanics of running a Kentucky restaurant, but the specific standards and the specific spirit that made this particular restaurant worth preserving. When Claudia approached them about acquiring Blackwood Hall and the Claudia Sanders dinner house, she was not conducting a transaction. She was making a selection. She was choosing the people she trusted to keep the thing alive. The Settles accepted without hesitation. The sale was completed. Claudia moved to a quieter residence in Shelbyville, smaller, less laden with the echoes of a shared life, more proportioned to a woman living alone in the final chapter of a long and substantive existence. She died on December 31st, 1996. She was 94 years old. She was buried beside Harland at Cave Hill Cemetery in Louisville, her name inscribed on the monument that their daughter Margaret had made, the 4 columns and the bronze bust, the grave where George Rogers Clark and Civil War soldiers already rested beneath Kentucky soil. Together in death as they had been in life, though not always in the ways the official history had found convenient to acknowledge. Their story was complicated and human, and in the end indivisible. The colonel and his lady, beneath the Kentucky sky they had spent their best years looking at from the porch of Blackwood Hall. What the Settles inherited was more than a restaurant and a mansion. They inherited a responsibility, and they met it with the particular dedication of people who understood precisely what they were protecting and why it mattered. The menu at the Claudia Sanders dinner house remained essentially unchanged. The fried chicken, the country ham, the fried green tomatoes, the creamed spinach, the yeast rolls that had achieved, over the decades, a quiet regional fame that no marketing budget had purchased and no focus group had engineered. The kind of reputation that accrues only to food that is genuinely, consistently, unreservedly good. The pies. Customers drove from Louisville and Lexington and points beyond, drawn by a combination of the food and the history and the specific quality that attaches to places that have been doing one thing well for long enough that the doing itself has become a form of testimony. Tour buses made regular stops. The passengers who climbed down from them arrived with appetites and cameras and the slightly reverential air of people visiting a site that carries more significance than its physical dimensions would suggest. The Settles welcomed them all, with the unhurried warmth of people who had learned from a masterclass in Southern hospitality and had decided that the lesson was worth keeping. Inside Blackwood Hall, time moved differently. The Settles left much of the house as Claudia had left it, which meant leaving much of it as Harland had left it, because the house, by the time Claudia departed, still bore the imprint of the man who had lived in it most fully and most consequentially. The original stove stood in the kitchen, cast iron and impassive, exactly where it had stood when Sanders cooked on it for the last time. His photographs lined the walls, his certificates, the personal objects of a life lived at high velocity and preserved, somewhat haphazardly, in the rooms where they had been set down and not moved again. But as the years passed and the Settles moved deeper into the house, into closets and drawers and storage areas that had not been systematically examined in decades, they began to understand that Blackwood Hall contained considerably more than what was visible on its surfaces. The Colonel and Claudia had been collectors in the way that people who live historically significant lives are often collectors, unconsciously, accidentally, by the simple accumulation of things that arrived and were never discarded. A letter here, a document there, objects placed in drawers and forgotten, not because they lacked importance, but because the people who placed them were too busy living the story to catalogue its artifacts. What the Settles found, as they worked through the house's accumulated holdings, was a private archive of American cultural history. A birthday letter from Richard Nixon, written on White House stationery, addressed to the Colonel in the particular formal warm register of presidential correspondence to celebrity constituents. The original Kentucky Colonel's certificate, the 1935 document that Governor Ruby Laffoon had bestowed upon Harland Sanders, and that Sanders had carried, psychologically, if not always physically, as the foundational credential of his entire second life. The first pressure cooker he had used to develop and refine the recipe, the specific device, unremarkable in its appearance, that had enabled a technological breakthrough in fast food preparation and changed the economics of the entire industry. The discoveries continued. The original KFC flag that had once flown in front of the Shelbyville headquarters before the corporate succession had moved the brand's center of gravity to Louisville and eventually to the anonymous corridors of multinational ownership. One of the first Kentucky Fried Chicken buckets, a primitive, almost touchingly humble ancestor of the containers that would eventually be produced in the billions, carrying the Colonel's face to every corner of the inhabited world. Signed guest books from the house's peak years, filled with the names of franchisees and journalists and curious visitors who had made the journey to Shelbyville to stand in the rooms where it had all begun. And then, at the back of a storage area, sealed and untouched, a reel of film, 20 minutes and 18 seconds long, dated 1965. The label, written in a hand that the settlers could not immediately identify, reads simply, "Promotion Kentucky Style." No one knew what it contained. No one, apparently, had watched it in 2 decades or more. The reel sat in its canister in the same patient, indifferent state that old film assumes when it has been waiting long enough, sealed against light and air, holding whatever it held, available to whoever was eventually willing to look. These were not souvenirs. They were not the decorative memorabilia of a man who had achieved fame and accumulated the objects that fame generates. They were primary documents, the physical evidence of a story that had shaped the way a significant portion of the human race ate its food, organized its evenings, and understood what it meant to build something from nothing in America. They would in time be offered to whoever proved willing to become their custodian. In the spring of 1999, fire came to Shelbyville. It broke out in the Claudia Sanders dinner house on a night that gave no particular warning, spreading through the building that had been, in sequence, a warehouse, a spice packaging facility, a restaurant that Sanders had opened in defiance of corporate pressure, and, for the 30 years since, the living continuation of a culinary tradition that predated the fast food revolution by decades. By the time the fire was brought under control, the original structure was gone. The dining room, the kitchen, the accumulated material history of 30 years of meals and conversations, and the specific warmth of a place that had been built with intention and maintained with care. The settlers stood in front of what remained and made the decision that defines a certain kind of character. They would rebuild, not relocate, not close, not accept the fire as a verdict and move on to something easier. They rebuilt on the same property, on the same ground, carrying the same name and the same menu and the same handwritten recipes that Claudia had preserved through her own long tenure as the enterprise's guardian. The new Claudia Sanders dinner house rose from the physical site of its predecessor, larger than the original, capable of serving more guests. A structure that bore the practical marks of reconstruction without surrendering anything essential about what the establishment had always been. The menu was unchanged. The yeast rolls arrived at tables with the same warmth. The fried chicken came out of the kitchen according to the same standards. Within months, the restaurant was serving customers as though the interruption had been a renovation rather than a catastrophe. Blackwood Hall, standing apart from the restaurant on the same property, had escaped the fire entirely. Protected by distance and by the particular fortune that attaches itself, sometimes, to things that are not yet finished with the world. The artifacts inside remained undisturbed. The original stove in its kitchen, the photographs and certificates on its walls, the sealed film reel in its storage canister. Whatever else had burned, the house had not. The 21st century arrived in Shelbyville the way it arrived everywhere. Gradually, then with an acceleration that made the gradual part difficult to remember. The America that had produced Harland Sanders, the America of roadside diners and handshake franchise agreements, and a Shell station in Corbin, Kentucky as the plausible starting point of a global empire, had been replaced by something operating at an entirely different scale and velocity. Kentucky Fried Chicken had become KFC, the rebranding itself a small but precise act of corporate self-reinvention. The abbreviation that quietly retired the Colonel's home state from the logo, while his face remained on the bucket, a living image increasingly detached from any specific geography or origin story. The company had changed hands multiple times since Brown and Massey had purchased it from Sanders in 1964 for $2 million. Heublein, R.J. Reynolds, PepsiCo, Yum, brands. The succession of corporate parents represented the standard trajectory of American consumer brands in the late 20th century. Acquisition, conglomeration, optimization, the relentless subordination of particularity to the demands of global scale. The chicken itself had evolved, adapting to new markets and new regulatory environments, and new consumer expectations in ways that Sanders, had he been watching, would have found both impressive and probably infuriating. At Blackwood Hall, the past held its ground. In the summer of 2022, the Settles made an announcement that moved, with considerable speed, through the specific communities of people who cared about such things. The house was for sale. They had protected the legacy for nearly 40 years. They had rebuilt after the fire. They had maintained the restaurant through economic downturns and changing tastes, and the particular challenges of operating an institution whose value is inseparable from its history, which means that every decision affecting it carries a weight that purely commercial operations are spared. They were elderly now. The work of stewardship is not diminished by experience. If anything, the longer you do it, the more clearly you understand what it demands. They were ready, as Claudia had been ready in 1984, to select the next custodian and place the burden in other hands. The listing was unlike anything in the ordinary vocabulary of American real estate. Buyers would receive the 5,000 square foot mansion and the 25,000 square foot restaurant, both situated on the same Shelbyville property where Harland and Claudia Sanders had built their enterprise from a warehouse and a domestic kitchen, and the refusal to accept that corporate ownership of their name meant corporate ownership of their standards. They would receive the trademark and likeness rights to the Claudia Sanders name, a commercial asset of genuine and ongoing value, attached to a restaurant that had operated continuously under that name for more than half a century. They would inherit the archive, the Nixon letter, the original Kentucky Colonel certificate, the first pressure cooker, the original KFC flag, the early bucket, the guest books, the sealed film reel from 1965, still unscreened, still holding its secrets in the patient darkness of its canister, and they would receive the recipes. Not the 11 herbs and spices. Those belonged to the corporate entity that Harland had sold in 1964 and had passed through 4 subsequent owners since, and now resided in the intellectual property portfolio of a company headquartered in Louisville with restaurants in 145 countries. The 11 herbs and spices were gone, absorbed into the machinery of global commerce, as Sanders had known they would be when he signed the papers. But the other recipes, the ones Claudia had written by hand, the yeast rolls and the creamed spinach and the fried green tomatoes and the pies that had sustained the reputation of this specific restaurant on this specific property for 50 years, those were still here, still in her handwriting, still carrying the specific domestic authority of a woman who had cooked for the Colonel and for the franchise empire and for the thousands of guests who had passed through the dining room and understood, eating the food, that they were eating something that had not been engineered by a committee. The asking price was $9 million. Prospective buyers were required to demonstrate a minimum of $5 million in liquid assets before the conversation could begin. And the Settles, in a condition that spoke precisely to the nature of what they were selling, stated clearly that priority would be given to buyers committed to preserving the legacy, retaining the long-term staff, and continuing the traditions that Harland and Claudia had established. They were not simply selling a property, they were selecting a successor. The response was global, and it surprised even the people who had expected it to be significant. Inquiries came from Japan, where KFC had become, through a marketing campaign launched in 1974 that attached the Colonel's chicken to the Japanese Christmas tradition, an annual ritual observed by millions of families who had never been within 5,000 miles of Shelbyville, Kentucky. They came from Canada, where Sanders had maintained his franchise rights until the sale, and where his name still carried the specific warmth of a founding figure. From Malaysia, from across Europe. From everywhere the Colonel's face had appeared on a bucket and lodged itself, permanently and without apparent effort, in the visual memory of people who had grown up eating the food without knowing anything about the man. The listing agents, by their own account, had not anticipated the depth of the devotion. People were not calling to inquire about a restaurant's revenue or a mansion's square footage or the condition of the commercial kitchen. They were calling because they wanted to become custodians of something they understood, instinctively, and without needing it, explained to be irreplaceable. Because they grasped that there are certain properties that carry a significance incommensurate with their physical dimensions. Properties where what happened matters more than what stands, where the building is less a structure than a vessel, and where ownership is less a legal status than an obligation. The Claudia Sanders dinner house still operates today. The menu has not changed in any essential way since Claudia Sanders oversaw it in the early 1980s, which means it has not changed in any essential way since Harland Sanders built the restaurant in 1968, which means it is serving food according to standards developed across decades of cooking that predate, by a considerable margin, the industry those standards helped to create. The fried chicken, the country ham, the yeast rolls, the creamed spinach, the pies. Customers who sit down in the dining room are participating, whether they know it or not, in a ritual that connects them to a specific and consequential history. To the back room of a Shell station in 1930. To the franchise kitchens, where an old man in a white suit demonstrated the proper technique to men who had travelled across the country to learn it. To the settlement negotiations that produced this restaurant's name and its independence. To the hands of a woman who wrote her recipes on paper and trusted the paper to outlast her. The connection is not metaphorical. It is material. The food on the plate was made according to instructions that Claudia Sanders wrote by hand. The building beside the restaurant, Blackwood Hall, its white facade still carrying the composed authority of a house that has been standing since 1866, still holds the original stove, still holds the photographs and the certificates and the artifacts of a life that reshaped the American relationship to food in ways that are still, decades later, being absorbed. What does a house mean when the people who built it are gone? The question is not rhetorical. It is the central question of preservation, the one that every generation that inherits a significant building must answer for itself. The Vanderbilts answered it by opening Biltmore to admission tickets and Christmas tours, and the particular democratic transformation of the private into the public. The National Trust answered it for Waddesdon by maintaining the chandeliers and the collections and the French formal gardens in a state of institutional permanence that individual ownership could never have guaranteed. Blackwood Hall offers a different answer, and in some ways a more honest one. It has not been turned into a museum. It has not been sanitized into a historic site where the human mess of the story it contains has been smoothed into a comfortable narrative for visitor consumption. It stands beside a working restaurant, on a working property, in a small Kentucky town where people still stop for dinner on weekday evenings because the food is good and the atmosphere carries a weight that chain restaurants, by definition, cannot manufacture. The house means what the story inside it means. A boy who lost his father at 5 and learned to cook because there was no alternative. A man who failed at more occupations than most people attempt and found his calling at an age when the culture had decided his story was already written. A woman who stood beside him for 30 years and whose name is on the building because the building would not exist without her. An enterprise built on a handshake and maintained, across multiple stewardships and a fire and 4 decades of corporate indifference, by people who understood that certain things are worth more than their commercial value. The mansion is proof that the story happened, not symbol, not metaphor, proof. When you stand in the kitchen at Blackwood Hall and look at the original stove, you are not contemplating a representation of Harland Sanders. You are standing in the same room where he stood. Your hand, if you reach out, touches the same iron his hands touched, on the same mornings, before the same Kentucky light came through the same windows and fell across the same floor. That is not sentiment. That is history made physical. The irreplaceable quality, that no reproduction, no digital archive, no corporate brand management campaign can replicate or replace. It is the reason old houses matter. Not because the past was better, not because the people who lived in them were larger than life, but because the physical continuity between then and now is the only honest antidote to the illusion that we exist in permanent discontinuity with everything that preceded us. As evening descends on Shelbyville, the light changes in the way it changes in Kentucky in the later hours. Warm and slightly amber, the hills going soft at their edges, the sky doing something unhurried and unspectacular that is nonetheless worth watching. Inside the Claudia Sanders dinner house, the dining room fills, families settle into booths, couples sit across tables carrying the easy silence of people who have been together long enough that dinner requires no performance. The yeast rolls arrive, the chicken, the particular domestic warmth of a room where the food is made by people who know what they are doing and understand why it matters. Across the parking lot, Blackwood Hall stands in the gathering dark. The windows are unlit. The porch is empty. The house makes no announcement of itself, no monument, no marker, nothing that would compel a passing stranger to stop and take notice. It simply stands, as it has stood since 1866, with the quiet persistence of a building that has weathered more than it has been asked to explain. It has seen the Civil War's aftermath and the Great Depression's long shadow. It has seen a global empire built in its kitchen and a corporate succession that tried, with partial success, to erase the specificity of what that kitchen represented. It has seen fire and rebuilding and the slow passage of 4 stewardships, each one a deliberate act of faith in the idea that what happened here deserves to continue. It has outlasted everyone who ever lived inside it, and still it waits, patient, white-columned, 3 acres of Kentucky ground, for whoever comes next, for whoever proves willing to accept the obligation that comes with the deed. To understand that owning this house is not a transaction, but a continuation. That the story it contains is not finished. That the Colonel, who refused to accept that his story was over at 65, who drove back roads for years before anyone agreed to pay attention, who built an empire from a recipe and a handshake, and the stubborn refusal to treat failure as a verdict, that the Colonel, in the only way that finally matters, has never entirely left. He is in the stove, in the walls, in the handwritten recipes that Claudia preserved, and the archive that the Settles kept, and the sealed film reel that still holds its 1965 secrets in the dark. He is in the food on the tables across the parking lot where families are eating dinner and not thinking about any of this, which is exactly as it should be. That is what a legacy looks like when it works. Not a monument, not a museum, a kitchen still cooking, a house still standing, a story still being told, by the people who eat the food and the people who make it, and the building that has been holding the memory of how it all began since long before any of them arrived, and will be holding it long after all of them are gone.